I am a university student now, but this incident happened when I was in the 8th grade. When I was around 14, I studied a subject focusing on outdoor pursuits. For our final assignment, 2 teachers took my class on a one-night camp where we would do activities like rock climbing, kayaking, trail walking, etc. I live in Australia, around an hour from a state forest that was notorious for the backpacker murders. Several bodies have been found and several more remain missing. I'm pretty sure all of the murders were linked to the same serial killer. Anyway, in the morning, we leave the school and drive out in a bus. When we reach the road that leads to the entrance of the forest, a police car is parked to the side. He spoke to the teacher for a moment, but I didn't hear anything and no one else seemed to notice or care. Fast forward a few hours and we've trekked to the camping area in the middle of the state forest. Some parts are state, some are privately owned. Whilst kayaking that afternoon, we noticed a helicopter doing flybys, but again, my classmates never suspected anything. A couple of mates and I were the first to leave the water and helped the teacher with some equipment and started building our own rafts. I was standing off to the side when one of the national park guides walked over to one of the instructors and talked in a hushed, slightly stressed out tone. I remember hearing the instructors say stuff like, "You're kidding and I don't believe it." He just looked shocked and taken back. So at this point, I started connecting the dots, but I didn't say anything to my school friends. Around dusk that night, I go to use the toilet block, which is around 100 meters from the main campsite. As I go in, I remember a guy walking around the other side of the block. I didn't see him very clearly in the diminished light, but he kept glancing around with nervous body language. I couldn't see his face clearly. He wasn't part of our party, and to me, he just didn't fit. I didn't think much of it at the time. Fast forward to the next morning when we get back to the car park. The teacher tells us that a body was found in a dam not far from where we were. They didn't want to tell us as to not frighten us. We later found out that it was a younger guy who was killed with an axe, and the guy who did it was related to the serial killer who hunted in the same area. I don't know if that guy I saw had anything at all to do with the murders, but it freaked me out a lot afterwards. I haven't been camping since. When I went home for 3 weeks, about a month and a half ago, my dad decided that we should do a bit of night fishing. I'm not a huge fan of night fishing, any sort of fishing, or my dad for that matter. Our personalities are way too similar, and if you leave us together for more than an hour, there may be blood left over by the time he and I are done playing several dozen rounds of fisticuffs between the stubborn arguing and shouting. Anyways, Dad decided to take me to this river up by our new house that they just finished building. My mom and brother stayed behind as we traipsed through the dark woods. Now, my family lives in Oregon, and the river was about 1.5 miles in from my family's property, over massive fallen trees and stumps that I easily tripped on, not knowing the lay of the land. My dad merely scoffed at me and reminded me that city living makes you soft, He didn't say it just like that, but something along those lines, like some stereotypical cowboy out of an Old West film. I blamed the fact that I didn't know the area as well as he did, and it just spiraled downhill from there, and arguing broke out between us, making the peaceful night loud and chaotic. We didn't stop arguing the entire way down the river. When we got to the river, we finally settled into an awkward, tense silence as we got our gear out. I knew that this fight was far from over as I sat down on a fallen stump and shivered my ass off. I had lived in a warm climate for over a year, and honestly, coming out here was probably him punishing me for even leaving the Pacific Northwest. We refused to talk to one another as our lights danced across the water when my dad suddenly stood up, his light landing on the other side of the river. There, on the other bank, stood a man looking right at us. He wore a bright orange t-shirt and a pair of scraggly jeans, but for the most part, looking pretty average, if you counted the machete hanging from his belt. My dad snapped at me to start packing up all of our stuff, so I followed his command as my dad started shouting at the man across the river. Their conversation was mostly lost to the roar of the white water, but I could see the man making agitated sweeps with his hands every time I dared to peek. Their voices grew and my fear grew with it. My father has never been one to carry protection in the woods, hence why I was born. This man was armed and possibly dangerous with that machete, and while we had the river between us, it was shallow and had plenty of places to cross if it was snow runoff. I had no doubt this man could be behind us in mere minutes. Had we wandered onto his property by mistake and just not have known it? "Drop the gear and let's go," my dad snarled at me as I took one last look up to see the man starting to walk into the water, his hand against his weapon. My dad put a firm hand on my shoulder and led me back into the woods towards our house. My dad is an ultra-marathoner. He runs like it's going out of style, and my mostly out-of-shape self probably wouldn't have kept up with him had I not been so terrified. I couldn't hear if the man was coming after us, my heartbeat being so loud in my ears, but I followed my dad so closely I almost ran into him several times. Finally, we found our road and made a break for my parents' house. As soon as we were through the front door, my dad had the doors locked and was keeping a vigilant watch out the windows, making sure no crazy men with machetes were creeping up on our house. Finally, when he figured there were no guys wearing orange t-shirts, we sat down and began to talk about our experience with my mom. We avoided the part where we had been arguing, but told her everything else. We went to bed without apologizing, and I honestly felt horrid. The next day, with the only gun he owned, my father and I walked back out into the woods after calling the police. They said that there was a guy who did enjoy scaring people off of forest land in the area and that we shouldn't be too concerned. Feeling a bit sheepish, we went back to the place where we had left our gear, both of us apologizing for our lackluster behavior the night before. When we returned to what we believed was the spot, we saw that our fishing poles had been bent and all the line had been draped from tree to tree and the tackle box was gone. However, my dad and I didn't fight again for the rest of my trip home. Thanks for bringing a temporary truce between my dad and I, crazy man, but let's never meet by the river again.